the only democracy in the Middle East, is about to shut down an adversarial media channel. Netanyahu says Israel...
You notice how all these democracies that we're supporting militarily shut down their press?
Yeah, that's right. Ukraine shut their press down too.
Yeah. It's a good thing we're defending these democracies.
Yeah. Netanyahu says Israel will shut down Al Jazeera in Israel. Israeli lawmakers passed a law on Monday allowing the government to temporarily shutter foreign media outlets that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has determined undermine the country's national security, and the Israeli leader said he would use the new law to block Al Jazeera broadcasts and activities in Israel. Mr. Netanyahu's government has had a tense relationship with Al Jazeera for years, but the Hamas-led attack on October 7th escalated tensions. Mr. Netanyahu has called Al Jazeera a Hamas mouthpiece. On Monday, the prime minister said it was time for the Qatar-backed network, one of the most widely viewed sources of television news in the Arab world, to stop broadcasting in Israel, although he did not specify when that would happen. The terrorist channel, Al Jazeera, will no longer broadcast from Israel. I intend to act immediately in accordance with the new law, not with the law, the new law, because they passed this through, to stop the channel's activity, Mr. Netanyahu posted on X while recovering from his hernia surgery. Yes, we're very sad to hear about his hernia surgery. We
wish him a speedy recovery.
Absolutely. Al Jazeera called Netanyahu's comments lies that incite against the safety of our journalists around the world. The network stresses that this latest measure comes as part of a series of systematic Israeli attacks to silence Al Jazeera, it said in a statement, adding that the new law would not deter us from continuing our bold and professional coverage. Under the new law, if the prime minister deems a foreign media outlet to concretely undermine Israel's national security, the government can temporarily close its offices, confiscate its equipment, remove it from Israeli cable and satellite television providers, and block access to any of the channel's online platforms hosted on servers in Israel or owned by Israeli entities. Wow. How democratic. So you see, that's pretty broad and pretty sweeping. The Committee to Protect Journalists, an independent nonprofit organization that promotes press freedoms around the world, criticized the new law, saying that it, quote, contributes to a climate of self-censorship and hostility towards the press. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, asked about the law during a news briefing in Washington, said that, quote, a move like this is concerning. Oh, really? We believe in the freedom of the press, she said. It is critical. The new law comes at a critical time in Israel's relationship with Qatar, which has been hosting ceasefire negotiations between Israel and Hamas. The Qatari government, which helps fund Al Jazeera, did not immediately comment. Now, this happens just as Israel rocked by largest protests since war began, as Netanyahu faces growing pressure. So Netanyahu was not a popular prime minister in Israel before October 7th. Over the summer, his Supreme Court power grab was the focal point of many street protests. But just a few days ago, these protests reached a record size of Israelis who are frustrated by his refusal to make a deal to bring the hostages home. Thousands of people took to the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem over the weekend in the largest protest Israel has seen since the start of the war against Hamas, a significant challenge to the increasingly embattled leadership of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Demonstrators are angry at Netanyahu and his government for not having secured the release of all the hostages taken captive during the October 7th terror attack. While 105 people were released during a temporary truce last year, another 130 that were kidnapped, are either dead or still being held by Hamas and other militant groups. Banners at the protests called on the prime minister to resign and for Israel to hold new elections. You failed, one poster read. Impeachment now read another. Look at the size of that. That is pretty huge. That is pretty huge.
Okay, let me just point something out, because we did a segment a while ago about how all of these so-called liberal Israelis who had been so horrified by the right-wing Netanyahu government that they were thinking about leaving Israel, all reaffirmed their dedication to Zionism after October 7th and decided this is their home and fully support the war effort. A lot of these groups that had been protesting Netanyahu actually changed their whole mission to supporting the war effort in Gaza. And if you look at what they're protesting, what they're demanding, it's not a word about the genocide in Gaza and not wanting to co-sign a genocide or be responsible for it. It's about their hostages.
Well, of course, yes.
That's it. There's not any outrage over what they're doing to these people. So keep that in mind. This is not a moral, conscientious objection to Netanyahu. They're just mad that he didn't deliver.
Right. And to the extent that they want the war to stop, it's that they would rather their hostages come back than that he flatten Rafah. But it's not out of like some altruistic, feeling that we shouldn't flatten Rafah because that's the wrong thing to do. It's they are afraid that if he keeps pushing the war, all the hostages are going to be killed, and they would rather have a halt in fighting so that they can get their hostages home. That's what he's under pressure for. There's not a whole lot of just morality-based anti-genocide sentiment in these protests. But I think it's important to point that out, because you know that the so-called liberal Zionists will try to hide behind this. No, the Israeli people, they don't support Netanyahu. I mean, we've seen this over the last few weeks, how people are trying to scapegoat Netanyahu in order to not be linked to the images of starving, dying children that are about to come out with even more frequency than we've seen. And look, if there were people protesting for a ceasefire, we would highlight that. We did. It was a very small crowd that was part of that ceasefire montage, but they were out there in Israel. We showed them. We did a segment on the Israeli dissenter. I forget what it was. It wasn't the Oscar speech. It was a speech before. Oh, it was at the Berlin Film Festival where there was an Israeli filmmaker who spoke out. So we're happy to, draw focus to Israelis who actually have a conscience and actually want this killing to end out of the kindness of their hearts. Unfortunately, there don't seem to be that many of them. But where there have been, we have covered that. We make a point to absolutely cover that. But this is more frustration with Netanyahu because they see him as an out-of-control psychotic maniac whose lust for war comes above his concern for his own hostages. And so that's what they're worried about. They want the hostages back. Netanyahu,
but in the end, it's ridiculous. He's not... Look, if you look at how Netanyahu is looking at this, it's not irrational, and it's certainly not out of line with the basic premises of Israel. He sees this as his opportunity. He's not undermining the premises of Israel. He's fulfilling them. Here's his opportunity to create greater Israel.
Of course. But I'm just saying, like, to the average Israeli, especially to the average Israeli whose family is being held, they just want the hostages back. Like, that's priority number one. And it's clearly not priority number one for Netanyahu. He's already turned down a full hostage exchange deal because it allowed for a 4.5-month ceasefire before he got in and flattened Rafah. And he turned that down. You can
see that his attitude is they can debate it in the history books after it's already done.
Of course. Yes. Netanyahu has said that the goals of the current war against Hamas are to bring back the hostages, destroy Hamas, and remake Gaza so that no militant group could ever carry out the type of attack that Israel suffered last year, in which about 1,200 people were killed. But the families of the hostages and demonstrators that came out over the weekend believe the Israeli government should be more focused on hostage retrieval than any military or security objectives. Aviva Siegel, one of 17 hostages released by Hamas on the third night of the temporary truce in November, called on Israeli authorities to take responsibility and put more effort into releasing her husband, who remains in Gaza, and other hostages held by Hamas and other militant groups in the Strip. "We are dying inside here," Siegel 62 said at a Saturday rally in Tel Aviv. Here's some footage of some of those big protests. As you can see, quite large. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that they're moving to shut down dissenting media inside Israel as these protest movements grow and grow. and grow. And granted, these protests are not motivated by the same sentiments necessarily that you would see in an outlet like Al Jazeera. But I don't think it's a coincidence that they're passing laws to shut down media as Netanyahu gets increasingly unpopular in his own country. They want to be able to shut down any opposition to him. In fact, it's widely thought inside Israel, even by people who, like we just said, are more concerned with getting their hostages back than they are with stopping famine. It is pretty obvious that Netanyahu is extending this war so that he can hold on to power. He just has to double and triple down on being the nationalist wartime leader and going as far as to say, no, we can't have elections while the war is going on. Well, That's what Zelensky said in Ukraine. We did a segment on this a while back. And so the censorship of a major news operation and the sweeping power that comes with that censorship to confiscate their equipment, right, to shut down streaming services that they broadcast to if Israel has an ownership of them. I mean, that is pretty widespread. That's pretty widespread. It's pretty clear that this is all part of an effort to, secure Netanyahu's own power.
Well, this is starting in Israel, but, you just sent over a story that you're going to cover, we'll probably cover it on both shows, about YouTube to prevent election misinformation, messing with the algorithm. Frankly, I think you're going to see a lot of countries suppress Al Jazeera because Al Jazeera is one of the most reliable sources of accurate news about this region out there, probably the most regarding that region. And we use Al Jazeera as a source a lot, even for stories that are not particular to that, because it's like you can put it reads like an old newspaper where you can see they actually cared about whether they were telling the truth.
Exactly.
And
yes.
And you can't feel that way. When we did the segment yesterday about these emerging payment services, and it was an NPR story, and it was their story specifically, so you couldn't go anywhere else for it. And I had to keep stopping and giving provisos because of the slant. And the entire American media is just completely out of control in that way. You have to tease out the information from all the framing and all the spin. Al Jazeera is one of the few sources where you don't need to do that, or don't feel you need to do that.
Yeah, no, you're right. It does feel like what the news used to be in a bygone era. And that's why, we use them all the time, even for issues that are not directly related to what we're talking about now. And notice, they'll say all these things. Well, it's a terrorist newspaper. Notice, just like when it came to WikiLeaks, they couldn't point to a single thing they got wrong.
Right.
Show me misinformation that they have put out there in either print form or video form, because they do both. They have YouTube channels up, and they have obviously their website. Nobody's ever debunked one of their pieces. It's all accurate. It all checks out, and I will often use that as a source to check other information. Like if I see a story getting out there, I will say, okay, did this show up on the Al Jazeera site? Just because if I know if it showed up there, okay, we can run with it. It's not to say I won't run with it if it didn't show up there, but I use that to say, okay, if they put it out there, it's solid. And so, just obviously a pretty desperate move to hang on to power and to control the narrative in an already fucking brainwashed beyond belief population. That's pretty desperate.
Today, Israel, tomorrow, America, via YouTube, via Google, they're going to come after Al Jazeera because it's such a beacon of honest reporting. They can't have that. They can't have that at this moment.
Please clap.